Hello, everybody, and welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm sorry about the initial hiccups, but we shall gradually get used to this thing. I originally got this thing together, this PowerPoint together, at the request of Dorothy Abel-Smith as an entertainment for the AGM of the Hertfordshire Building Preservation Trust. And at the time, I thought, crumbs, I don't know anything about this at all. So I scrambled around and got it together, and people received it quite pleasantly. And I was asked to do it several times again. So people who've seen it at the Hertfordshire Building Preservation Trust or at the East Herts Archaeological Society or at various other places, I'm sorry, you're going to see the same pictures again, but the actual text will have changed somewhat, I hope, because it's an ongoing thing and you learn more and more about these things as you go on, and more avenues open as you explore these features more. Anyway, the point is when we had James Betley speaking a couple of weeks back, and he said he thought the New River was the nicest thing in Hertfordshire, I thought, well, somebody might like to see my PowerPoint about the New River, which has been lurking around for a couple of years now, but some people may not have seen it, and they might enjoy doing so in this dreadful era of pandemic and God knows what. Anyway, this was made, as I say, a few years ago, and the text, as I say, will alter somewhat. So we go back 400 years. The amazing thing about this New River is that it's neither new or a river. And people will say that to you. It's been there for 400 years, which I think must be a record in some Guinness Book of something or others. And it was made, it's an artificial watercourse made for the purpose of taking fresh water to London in the time of Queen Elizabeth. This is now, what we're looking at now is London in 1612. This is Vischer's View, which is in the London Museum, and you can see St. Paul's without its hat on. It hasn't been burnt down and it hasn't got its spire. And you'll see just to the right of St. Paul's, with the spire on the skyline, is the one in Cheapside. I can't remember the name's gone out of my mind now. The one that you have to be born near to, St. Mary Le Bow. And you can see the bridge here, and you can see Southwark Cathedral in front of it, and Westminster, the theatres on the south bank, and the hall of the bishops of what's the place called again with W, Wessex. Anyway, I'm going to go to the next one, and there we can see this is Southwark Cathedral now, and here's the bridge, and there's lots of water, and here's the bridge with the heads of the traitors, all like lollipops, on the top of the bridge, just to warn you. And this view is very, very interesting. I have it pasted to my wall at home because you can examine it and find new things. And there's cows and carriages and all manner of detail, which is all worth looking at. Anyway, this is the London of Queen Elizabeth, or at least James. This is 1612. And if you wanted to go up and down the river, it was tidal, of course, as it still is. And because it had lots of little arches, the tide, when it was going up or down, went through like a torrent, and which gave the possibility of driving a pump, particularly on the north side of the river. And you can see in this picture, which has come out of a nursery rhyme book, but it actually gives you more the feeling of the state of the river and the pumping engine, which lay on the north side of the river and pumped water. Presumably we can get back to recycling the energy and whatnot. Eventually we should get back to using the river current to pump some water somewhere. However, the Elizabethans had it all organised, and the water was actually operated by a wheel, which was underneath the last arch of the bridge on the north side. And you can see the state of the current when it was throwing at full tide through the bridges, and you had to go very carefully through on the right stage of the tide, otherwise you get swept away. Anyway, I've just put Queen Elizabeth up there to remind ourselves that we're talking now about 1600, just before the Queen died. And a gentleman called Mr. Colthurst who had done several enterprises to do with water at Bath and at Cambridge and what have you, decided that it would be a good idea to try and get an Act of Parliament to permit him to actually and start off a scheme to bring fresh water to London. So before the Queen died, the actual legislation was started upon before the Queen died in about 1602. So the Queen died, of course, in 1603, and James came to the throne. And there were problems with James, which is of a different order, which we'll talk about in a minute. But what we need to look at is the London of that time. This is Cheapside, and we're looking at it particularly because Hugh Middleton, who we've just been looking at the front, lived just off Cheapside. He was a goldsmith, and the Goldsmiths' Hall is just on the north side of Cheapside, and the shops that you can see in the actual both north and south of Cheapside belong to the goldsmiths. Probably they still do. But the actual properties were let to actual active goldsmiths, and they were lock-up shops, a bit like the ones that you see on the bridge at Florence, with shutters at the ground floor to keep the thieves out, and so that you could open them up when you wanted to open the shop. But what was important was that in front of the shops and Cheapside was the Cheapside conduit, which was where you could got your water from. And you turned up at the conduit, which you can see on the right-hand side of the picture, with your, looks like beer steins, but they're actual jugs, water-containing jugs, and you collected your water and you took it home. The church which is there has gone. If you can actually read the caption at the bottom, it tells you it's St. Michael le Quern, which was demolished quite a long time ago. But the Cheapside conduit was quite important. And if you want water at your house, you got a character called a water carrier who turned up with his coal scuttle and filled it from the conduit and brought it to your house and tipped it in your cistern. And that was your water supply until you paid another 2p, and he'd fetch you another one. It was 2p a canful to get the chap to fetch it from the conduit. And when Mr. Middleton and company started to suggest that they would make water automatically available, these people were very disquieted because they thought they were going to lose their custom of 2p a can to bring the water to your house. So there are still conduits around. This is the one in Cambridge, Hobson's conduit, which I've just put in just to remind you that they still exist. And you turned up with your jug and you collected your water from the conduit and took it home and tipped it into your cistern. The works underneath the north side of the bridge were renewed at various occasions, but they did operate right through the 17th century, in fact. But they were installed in the 1580s and operated right through the 17th century and pumped water out of the Thames over the bridge where St. Magnus the Martyr is on the north side there. And it was alleged that the pressure that they could get from this engine would drive the water over the roof of St. Magnus the Martyr if you wish to do so. If you lived at Watton Stone or other places, you may have a local pump, which you could go to get your water. This one, I gather from Dorothy that one of her ancestors, in fact, presented this to the village at Watton, but it is a particularly grand pump, and that's how it looks at Watton. So this was the customary way of getting your water. It wasn't in the house, you went and fetched it. That's the point I'm making. This is the only fraction of the Cheapside Cross, which lay just a bit further down Cheapside from the Cheapside conduit, and was one of the Eleanor crosses. It was destroyed at the time of the Commonwealth, in actual fact, but it did in fact have the arms of the Queen Eleanor, and you can see the 3 lions of England on the left-hand side, just like the chaps have on their shirts. And at the right-hand side, you can see the Lion and the Leon and Castile, which are on the all the Eleanor crosses, including the one outside Charing Cross Station. I've just put that down to remind you that Charing Cross, the Cheapside Cross, this is the Cheapside Cross, not Charing Cross, lay next to that conduit in Cheapside. This is Cheapside right now. There ain't no cross and there ain't no conduit, but there's a lot of city gents marching up and down. But that is the Church of St. Mary le Bow, down Cheapside. But the goldsmiths' shops lay right and left and where the present things are. Let's go on. This is Cheapside from the north, and you can see the Cheapside cross there on the left-hand side of the picture. This is the coronation procession of Edward VI. And you can see St. Paul's Cathedral there, which has still got its spire on, because that didn't fall down until in the middle of the reign of Edward VI. But you can see the river behind, and you can see the goldsmith shops, which they've got hanging with all sorts of jolly things hanging from them, because they've all hanging out of the windows in order to see the coronation procession. But on the ground floor, you can see the windows with all the goldsmiths' jolly goods exposed for sale on the ground floor, because there were sort of shutters that came down so you could see what was for sale in the shop. And above that, when it was a coronation, of course, they've got all sorts of fancy things above. This is the same scene, Cheapside again. This is 1642. This is the procession of the mother of the Queen, Henrietta Maria, going back home. I think everybody was glad to see the back of her, tell you the truth. So she was going back down to Dover to go back to France. But you can see now on behind, there are still the goldsmiths' shops, and they are covered again because there's a procession, but you can see the upper stories. So this is where the goldsmiths operated. And Mr. Middleton, as you can see, if I put the arrow through it, here's his name here, Hugh Middleton. So Hugh Middleton has a tenement, and he's got it from 1607, and he's got it to 1637, and he's paying £30 a year, and it's in Cheapside. This is the rentals of the Goldsmiths Company, in which his name occurs here, and also on the next page, because round the corner is St. Matthew's Alley, which is a right-hand turn off street, Cheapside, and he has two more properties here, Hugh Middleton and Hugh Middleton. And here again, 1607, and 1607 is the date of the lease that he's got on these properties. So Mr. Middleton was a goldsmith and operated in Cheapside with his properties there. He thought, as did quite a lot of people, that it was time that they did something about the water supply to London. And it was well known for a fact that the chalk here goes either side of London. In the middle, there's a London clay, but just at Ware, there is a finger of chalk which comes down here and provides a filter for the nice clean water to be filtered through the chalk, and provides springs which come out at Ware, which is exactly here, and then Fode. So the idea was to use the springs at Ware in order to generate the water. Anyway, Mr. Middleton came from an old Welsh family. His name wasn't really Middleton. He had a Welsh name, which was completely unpronounceable, but they took the name Middleton because they inherited some land in Shropshire in a village called Middleton. So the family became called Middleton, and they still are called Middleton. But that wasn't their real name. They are Welsh people, and they came from North Wales, and they were among the gentry of this part of Wales. And here's Denbigh, where they lived, Denbigh Castle. Let's go on. So this is Denbigh. This is my old school here. This is why I became interested in this factor, because I was at school at this place, which is now being sold off to the Chinese and is occupied by all the millionaires of Shanghai, I think, but that's another story. However, Mr. Middleton was born in this house here called Gouch Hill, and the other properties of the Middletons were this one called Gweinenog, and the church in which they attended is this one here, which is called Whitchurch, and their neighbours were the family up here, which have just got under Terry's place, but the church of Llueni, which was the other family, were the Salisburys of Llueni, who were the local gentry. And these very big houses called Plaslis and Plasit and Plastin were the big manor houses of this part of the Clwydian Valley, which was quite a prosperous place at that time. But the Middletons were governors of the castle here. Let's go on. Here's the castle. The castle as you see it, the piece that you see there was built by Edward I. The designer was James of St. George, and you can see his hallmark of the fancy brick, fancy coloured stonework, as you see on Carnarvon. So here's a castle which was looked after by Hugh's father. They were hereditary governors of the castle, and that still stands to this day. This is the middle of Denbigh. That's my grandson here. This is the middle of Denbigh, and there are still old buildings in Denbigh which must have been familiar to Hugh and his family as they were growing up with their father in charge of the castle. This is the pub at Denbigh. It used to be called the Bull, and my parents used to stay here when they came to visit us on exeats. That's my son in Paris, and these are my grandchildren. That's another story. However, it's no longer called the Bull for some reason, but it is a very nice pub inside. This is the 17th century part, which would have been familiar to Hugh and his family. This was added on in the 18th century, but there are quite nice rooms inside there. If you go inside and you find the knives and forks, above the knives and forks, there is a very nice staircase going up, dating from probably the 1590s, that sort of date. Elizabethan woodwork, and you can see briefly on the middle of it, on the actual newel post, is a hand. Now, it is said that this is a hand because there was a glove making manufacture in Denbigh, but this is, to my mind, this is not a glove because it's got knuckles and fingers. It is the upright hand, the right hand. In heraldry, it's called dexter proper. It is the right hand in the right colours, and it's got fingernails and what have you on it. So this is the actual badge of the Middletons. It's the upright hand. Their motto was Virtus Palma, an upright hand. I only just discovered that, but and then I connected, of course, virtus meaning upright or correct or virtuous, and palma meaning the hand. Anyway, that's their motto, which you find at odd places. Anyway, that's the actual upright hand which occurs. Anyway, the burial place of the Salisburys and most of the local gentry was this church, which is painted white and is called Whitchurch. It's on the outskirts of Denbigh, and when I was at school, we used to go there on Sundays occasionally because the vicar was a bit less boring than the other vicar, and it was a very nice church to visit. It's a nice perpendicular church, and inside these are the monuments of the Salisburys. And this one you can see the date on, 1578. Now we think Hugh was born about 1560, so he probably saw this monument being put up. And over the other side of the church, underneath this side, is the monument to his father. This is the monument to Hugh's father. I'll put it, it's brass and of a very Puritan sort of tone when you actually look at it. Let's put it up close. This is taken out of Pevsner's Cluid volume, and you can actually see the actual text. I won't bore you with all the details, but it is quite interesting. Here's Mr. Middleton, Father Middleton, and these are all the boys. Hugh must be about this one, I think. Thomas was his older brother, was one of the elder ones. He was one of the younger ones, and he had a load of sisters as well. And in fact, this actual monument doesn't mention their names. It has the name of God in Hebrew, which was the thing to do. You didn't have anything to do with Latin. Hebrew was the fashioner thing, and it says she died the last of December 1565 at 40. He died February 75, and he was 67. It doesn't even say their names, but the last three words at the bottom are what give you the clue, and it says an upright hand. So that is the actual family motto, although it doesn't actually mention it. You've got to understand from the place in the pub and the hand on the stairs that that's what they're talking about. But the actual clicking of those facts together has only just recently occurred to me. Anyway, here's Cheapside, and this is Cheapside at the top, and St Matthew's Alley goes down here, and these are the houses of the goldsmiths. This is the church which Hugh was a church warden of, the parish church of St Matthew's in Friday Street. Friday Street is the street coming down here. It was the one you could see on that modern thing with some coffee shops in the middle of it. Anyway, it went down here. This is St Paul's. It lies just here. Let's go on. These illustrations I've got, I have pinched from a fantastic work, which when I started on this enterprise, I went across the road to County Hall and fished around in the library there and found two personally funded volumes about the New River written by a chap called Michael Kenzie. Now, they are absolutely fantastic, and he published them at his own expense, and they were done originally to commemorate the quadricentenary, whatever it is, in 2012. And I looked through all these and thought, well, these are absolutely fantastic. And Mike was very, very kind and allowed me to pillage some of his pictures. So this is Mike's work, and he says here, so Hugh Middleton was buried here that the church was destroyed, and all remains ended up in Ilford Cemetery. So I thought that was a bit sad, really, that he should end up in Ilford Cemetery. However, but he was a church warden of this church, and his children were baptized. That is the situation at the moment of Friday Street. It's vanished under various modern developments. I've just put this in to remind myself I'm talking about goldsmiths, because the goldsmiths had still do, have the obligation to stamp every item in gold and silver that is produced in this country to verify that it is in fact gold or silver, and it is of the right purity. And they have still to this day, they have machines. I was very pleased to be welcomed in there by the assay office, and they will, if you play your cards right, you can go into the assay office and see them actually determining how much gold and silver there are in these various items. In the old days, they had what was called a touchstone, and they had a set of samples which they kept, and you rubbed these on the touchstone, and depending on the colour it made, you could tell how pure the gold was. And that was the job of a goldsmith. So although Hugh was a goldsmith, I'm not quite sure whether he actually did much of the actual smithing. His main aim as a member of the Goldsmiths Company was to control the inflow and outflow of bullion and make sure that what you were buying was what you thought you were buying, and that the international trade, mainly through Antwerp, he was sent to Antwerp as an apprentice, where Sir Thomas Gresham had been the Queen's ambassador in Antwerp. Antwerp was the centre of most dealing, and Sir Thomas Gresham had built the London Exchange, which stands opposite the Bank of England, not the modern one, but it's still got his grasshopper sticking on the top. Anyway, he was apprenticed in Antwerp, and his business was actually controlling the inflow and outflow of bullion into and out of London. I've just put James here to remind ourselves. This is James I, who of course came along in 1603, and it was part of Mr. Colthurst's interest to interest the king in this enterprise of bringing water to London, and the king was interested. From the beginning of his reign, he thought, well, that was a good idea, and he wanted to have a share in it. This is the Queen, who was one of the customers of Mr. Middleton and his goldsmiths. She was very keen on goldsmithery, and you see she's got several badges. This is an S, which was her sister Sophie, and this is a C, which was her brother Christian IV. He was King of Denmark. So she's showing her family things, and she's got an IHS here showing that she was tending towards the Catholicism end of the spectrum, and various other items. But she ran up quite a lot of expenses with the goldsmiths, most of which weren't paid by James because he wasn't very good at paying the bills. However, the chap who was in control of most of the affairs of the day was Robert Cecil, who lived at Theobald's or Tibbald's, whichever you like to call it. And he had taken over when the Queen died and arranged the transfer of the crown from the Queen to James I. And he's here with his garter around his knee, and his George, which he's holding very carefully, make sure it doesn't get lost. So he was the power behind the throne, and he happened to live right in the course of the New River at where is Theobald's Grove Station. You can call it Tibbald's or whatever you like. Anyway, I'm going to call it Theobald's because that's how it's spelt. Anyway, Robert Cecil lived at Theobald's, and when the king came down from Scotland, he stayed there, and he thought it was a jolly nice place to stay. In fact, Robert Cecil decided it would be a good idea to swap houses, so he gave the king Theobald's and took from the king, from the royal estate, Hatfield, which he then built his own house, which is there. This is one of James's coaches, which he sent to the Tsar. I just put it in because I thought it was interesting. You can see the sort of thing that they went trundling around in. This is preserved in Moscow. It is the only carriage of its period which is still surviving, and in order to see it, you have to go to Moscow. But there was an exhibition in London where they brought a model of it anyway. But that is the carriage that James sent as a gift to the Tsar. Anyway, James, here he is going down the river in his boat, going to the theatre. Here's the theatre on the left-hand side, and you can see James in his boat. They took the Queen down, didn't they, in the pouring rain on some trip in a boat which is made to look like it. Anyway, he's got a guard of honor around him, and he's going upriver because you didn't go on the roads if you could help it. It was far easier to go by water, and that was much safer. Anyway, the goldsmiths made all sorts of fancy things. These are the sort of things that they made. The biggest collection of Elizabethan and Jacobean silver is still in Moscow, because most of it was burnt that was in England, was melted down in the Commonwealth, and it's very rare to find even chalices that are pre-Commonwealth. But the biggest collection is, as I say, in Moscow, and these are brought there for an exhibition at the V&A, I think it was some time ago. Anyway, this is the sort of thing that the Elizabethan goldsmiths got up to selling. It's quite miraculous to think that at such an early age they had such sophisticated, particularly the watch and the jewellery, which they made. The jewels that they were found, I won't go on about this, there is a hoard which was found in Cheapside, which is of this period, and it's more or less the next door to the shop which Hugh must have had. This Cheapside hoard was found before the First World War, and it's in the London Museum. They've got it locked away at the moment and you can't see it. But when they do get it out, this is one of the treasures of it. It's an emerald watch. It's two halves of an emerald sawed in half, and the watch is in the middle, and it's got a little winder and it shuts shut, and the whole thing is smaller than a 50p piece. But we're not talking here about, ham-fisted peasants. We're talking here about the highest skill in goldsmithing in Europe, and they were buying and selling the very best goods that were available. Anyway, we'll leave the goldsmiths in London and take ourselves off to Hertfordshire. So we don't quite know what Theobald's Tibbles was like. We think that it looked something like this, and it is quite close to the River Lee, in actual fact. And it was the biggest house in the country at the time, and occupied by Robert Cecil and his family. And the king then moved in when Robert Cecil moved into Hatfield, and the king then occupied this site, which was actually on the edge. This is another picture of Theobald. There are several different views of what it must have looked like. But if you go there to this day, what you will see is a bit of broken down. It's in a park called the Cedars. If you go in there and walk around, you can actually see these bits of Robert Cecil's house still standing, but it's very fragmentary. However, later in the 17th century, it was that the house was pulled down, a larger house was built, and by that time they built the New River, which flowed in front of Theobald's Tibbles, in front of the castle, front of the actual house. James was very fond of Hertfordshire. This is his building where he liked to stay in Royston. He was coming and going up and down through Ware and Hertford, going up hunting in Royston very frequently. And this is a pair of gloves which he gave to, when he entered Hertfordshire, coming down from Scotland on his accession, he gave these gloves to the Lord Lieutenant of the county as a gift. It was to give something off the king's own hands, was felt to be very personal. Gloves had a very personal attachment to people. They're in the V&A, and you can go and see them at your wish. I'll miss out James, there he is. Anyway, James was very interested in building the New River, and in fact, at one stage he fell in, and they had to fish him out. This is quite a jokey sort of gatepost, which has been made by Mike Ken. In fact, made this himself to show that the king fell off his horse, and they had to fish him out 1 January in 1622. But I just put that in to liven things up. Anyway, the springs at Ware were well known from medieval times. We are now standing with our backs to the golf course. The pub, which is now called the King's Meads pub, there is a green fence there, and if you poke the camera, there is a gate, and you go through there, and you come upon this round pond. You're looking across the meads here, and you can see the main road coming down from Cambridge on the viaduct across the way, and you can see two white buildings on the actual meads behind the cows. This is an oldish picture. It is much more overgrown. There are lots of brambles, and I did walk down there with Mike, but it was quite a job to get through, and we had to push the brambles aside to get through. This is one of Mike's photographs taken from some time ago when it wasn't quite so overgrown. This is the chap. I'm sorry it's a lousy picture. I must get it improved. The other end of the, from the banjo, where there was another round pond, was at Islington, behind Sadler's Wells, where the theatre is now. And it belonged to this gentleman called Mr. Backhouse, who had agreed he would take shares in the New River Company and, in fact, facilitate the other end of the enterprise by making his duck pond at Islington, which was another round pond available for the New River to form its terminus at the Islington end. I must get a picture of it. That's from the National Portrait Gallery, and it's a lousy picture, but I'll get another one. Anyway, the idea was to make a river course then from Ware, which is in the north of this map here, to come right down to Islington and to follow more or less parallel to the River Lee, but in actual fact to be completely separate from the Lee and to be completely artificial. And you can see it says here, there's Tibbles here, and it says Middleton's River. And here it says Middleton's Water. So this is one of the original plans to how she make this water come from Ware and to wiggle, wiggle, wiggle down here and to end up in another round pond, which is here at Islington, which was seemed a good idea. And a lot of people, they were very adventurous at that time. They were planning adventurous trips to America and settling. We're talking now about the early part of the 17th century and talking about the East India trade and the West India trade and what have you. So there was a lot of financing of enterprise going on. And one of these enterprises was Hugh Middleton's scheme to make the river go. Now we're looking here, and this is Hugh, and his coat of arms here, you see, has got the upright hand at the top. And it's a right hand, and it's proper. It's the colour you would want a hand to be. He's also got a red hand on his coat of arms because he had been made a baronet. The king was giving away baronetcies to people who he thought were a good thing, of which Hugh was one. And this is the arms of his family, which has 3 wolf's heads on a green ground with white. And the green and white is a sort of an echo back to the Welsh situation, which is still the same as the Welsh flag has green and white. And the Tudor livery was green and white. So they had a green and white ground with 3 wolf's heads. And Hugh had them arranged on a triangle. I don't know why this, oh, here's the cursor. In a triangle here. His brother maintained the old way of having the 3 heads going sideways, but he's still got the upright hand in the corner. Anyway, he's holding, it's disappeared now, wouldn't it? Let's get him back. Let's get him back. Whoopsie, where's he gone? Here he is. He's holding a shell, which was a sort of an allusion to water, and the picture has water coming out of here. So this is Hugh. He was master of the goldsmiths on various occasions, not just once, but he was not Lord Mayor. His brother did become Lord Mayor, and I don't know if we've got a picture of him, but that's Hugh anyway. I just put this in to suggest what his family must have looked like. These are the capels at Haddam Hall, and this is the sort of clothes that people of those days would have been wearing. This is a cup which Hugh had made and given to the Goldsmiths Company. It is actually part of the Goldsmiths treasure, and it has, in fact, if you can see in the middle, his name and his arms. There's a picture of it close up. At this point, it's got Hugh Middleton over the top, and the spelling of it varies. He sometimes spells it with 1 D and 2 various things. However, Hugh Middleton is in the middle, and you'll see that the 3 wolf's heads are now lying sideways. They're in the top and the bottom quadrants of this arms. But after 1622, when he got his baronetcy, he changed to have them in a pile, is what's called in heraldry, in a triangle, and the 3 heads were here. But these are the 3 heads, and they were on green and white. and that was his gift to the Goldsmiths Company, which is still held there today. I put this in a Hatfield in case we can't remember, but we from Hart, we know what we're talking about. Anyway, here's the plan of the river, and it starts up here at Ware, and it comes wiggling down parallel to the Lee. The Lee is here, and the river goes wiggle, 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 wiggle all the way through because it had to be level. The trouble with the Lee was flowing in its natural course, but it had locks on it and mills also. But the New River had not to go flowing and empty itself. It had to flow gently all the way to London, as it still does. It's nice to watch it. Well, if you watch a leaf go past, it just gently floats past without rushing along, because they made it level all the way to London. It follows the 100-foot contour or the 30 meters contour, and it is level all the way. But the trouble is there are side valleys which go up the side, and so it had to be taken in loops to accommodate these side valleys which interrupted the levelness of the flow. And the one that you'll see at the moment is Whitewebs. If you've been up there, there's a museum of transport which has been put there, which is quite interesting. Let's go on to the next. But further down, when it got to London, because the actual contour made a lot of wiggles, it made some enormous great big curves down towards Hornsey and Haringey, and when time it got to Stoke Newington here, and then it got wiggle, wiggle, wiggle down to the New Riverhead at Islington. So although it was made originally, it occupied 42 miles of actual length of the actual course of the actual river, although the actual, as the crow flies, it was not more than 20. So it was more or less double. But the aim was not to have navigation, as the problem was with the Lee. The aim was to have a water supply which would flow gently and consistently from the spring at Ware right down to Islington. But the problem was that the people, here we are at Islington, we'll talk about that in a minute. When they got to Islington, the plan was to have another round pond, which is Mr. Backhouse's pond, and build a house on here, which would be the headquarters of the New River, the New Riverhead. And from there, the water would be distributed to those people who had paid a subscription to have a water supply to their houses, piped from this reservoir. And they would pay so much per annum to have the right to have the water. The water would not flow all the time. A man would come and switch it on. Well, and you would have it for a couple of hours, and it would fill up your cistern, and then he would switch it off. And depending on the subscription you'd paid, you would get more or less water than everybody else. However, that was the actual aim, to have the water flowing all the way from Ware down to Islington, where it would be distributed there. Now, I'm not going to go through all the ins and outs of how it was built. If you want to look at that, go and look at Mike Kenzie's books. There are copies in all the county libraries, and he's gone through mile by mile of where they had the mole catchers because they had a leak and they had to get clay to do it up, and they had various machines. They had loads and loads of labourers digging this thing. But the fact is that in their doublets and hoses, looking like something out of Shakespeare, they actually dug and made this river all the way from Ware to Islington, completely level all the way, no locks, and it flowed, and they got it going by 1612, which seems to me to be a complete miracle. And that is what's so miraculous about the thing. This is a bit of a later picture of this same round pond. This is a bit later. You can see St. Paul's has got a dome on it by now, and it had filter beds behind it so that the water was filtered when it got in there. This is another of Mike's pictures, which I've pinched from his work. Here's the actual water house, which we saw a picture of, and behind it, there were the actual pipes that went out to supply the contributors who had paid this princely sum to have piped water to their houses from that part of London. Of course, you were high up here. I think you were about 100 feet up, which is why the 100-foot contour is maintained all the way from Ware. It only loses a very small amount. I can't remember the exact figure, but the amount of drop on the whole river from end to end was very small, in inches, in fact. But the actual setting up of the thing was a considerable endeavour. I've just put this in for people who aren't from Hertford because they don't know what we're talking about. But we know that we're having a bit of a controversy at the moment about the word Kingsmeads. David Perman doesn't like it being used. He said the Kingsmeads was only this bit here and this bit there. In fact, he's writing a paper to tell people that the Kingsmeads does not apply to all this water here. And there's a scheme at the moment to upgrade the Kingsmeads and have the birds and the bees and what have you preserved by the London Middlesex Natural History Society. So there's a bit of controversy about this word Kingsmeads, which I won't go into. However, the New River starts at Amwell here, Ware here, and it goes then down here. And if you go on the road between Ware and Hertford, you will pass the green railings all the way down here, which takes it down to Great Amwell down here. And then it comes out and ends up where the first illustration I had showed you. This is Hugh Middleton's writing. The only word I can actually find out of this is Edmund. I can see the word Edmund here, and I think it's referring to Edmund Colthurst because he's being paid 10 quid, which is more than anybody else. And he was in fact kept on by Hugh Middleton as a supervisor of the enterprise during its building, although he was the one who had thought of it in the first place, but Middleton took over the organisation and the financing of it and the getting the right shareholders from the city companies in fact to make the thing take off. That's his signature. And you can see he spells himself with a double D and an EL. So that's why I've persisted with that. But you'll see it spelt in different ways. He was Welsh speaking. There is writing of his in Welsh. I'm interested at the moment to wonder if Queen Elizabeth spoke Welsh because her main nurse was Welsh speaking. Blanche Parry spoke Welsh. She liked the Welsh dragon on her coat of arms. She liked green and white behind them. She was very keen on persisting in her Tudor ancestors, and the Welshness of it has quite a lot to say. Anyway, these two people are at Wormley, and they were the local bigwigs at Wormley, lived at Wormley Bury, and they didn't like the New River being dug at the bottom of their garden. This is Mr. Purvoy, he was called. He was actually Robert Cecil's sidekick at Hatfield. And I was interested in because this daughter was related to some other people at Stortford, which I happened to be interested in. Anyway, he didn't like this, and they managed to hold the actual digging up for nearly 10 years while they argy-bargied about who did what and whether they should be allowed to have this dreadful New River at the bottom of their garden. However, they went along to Cambridge and got a chap, a geometer from Caius College. This is Caius College, Cambridge. This is the gate which had been recently put there. And the chap from Cambridge was engaged to sort out the levelling and make sure that the water flowed at 100 feet all the way to London without going up or down or falling out the other end. So it was a miraculous thing to do at that period from a surveying and a mathematical point of view, seems to me. Anyway, by 1612, they managed to dig the whole thing from Ware to Islington, and they opened it in September 1612. And at that, it just so happened that Hugh's brother was a Lord Mayor. He was just being installed in that September. Now, I'm not sure. This is a 19th century imagination of the opening of the New River. And I'm not sure who's supposed to be who. I'm not sure whether this is supposed to be Hugh or his brother, the Lord Mayor. His brother was Thomas. I think this is Mr. Colthurst. I've got a sort of feeling that Mr. Colthurst was down here, looks a bit like him. But these are various other people. But it's entirely imaginary. It's the 19th century picture. But they imagined that the water was allowed to flow suddenly into this duck pond at Islington. And then it would flow down these magic pipes into the actual people's houses. James was very interested in it and took a big share in it from its initiation. And he granted them a charter in 1618, which has still here's the St. Paul's without its lid on. It's still got lost its spire and it hasn't got the dome on the top. But this is the idea of the city receiving water and the motto, which is still on the side of any buildings which belong to what became Thames Water, or the London Metropolitan Water Board, or various names which it has acquired on its way. But that is the original badge of the New River Company, granted by James. He took a half share. He said he would put up half the money. Well, he hadn't got any money, actually, but he said he had. And he would put up the money, provided he could have half share of the profits. Unfortunately, they didn't make many profits in the initial stages. They did in the end. And by that time, his son, Charles, had in fact sold his father's share back to the shareholders, which was quite a complicated business. But the royal chunk, the king's log, as they called it, was in fact given back to the company by Charles after his father had died. So here we have the New River Head. This Sadler's Wells Theatre is just about here. This is the round pond and the filter beds. But quite shortly after they'd got the thing going, the pipes came out. You can see them coming out here, and they went then down into London. The pressure was not really sufficient to make it run. So they decided that what they needed was another pond higher up. So they went up the hill as far as, this is Pentonville Road, and they built another pond, an upper pond here. The only trouble was that the water had come down the New River into here, and they had to pump it into the upper pond to get more pressure. It's a bit like, I don't know about you have trouble with your bathroom shower, but if you don't have the shower head at the right heat, it just dribbles, doesn't it? And if you want it to be actual flow, you've got to bring it down and make sufficient head of water to make the thing flow. Anyway, this arrangement of the upper pond still exists to this day. It is underneath the street opposite, this is Pentonville Road, and it is a square called Claremont Square. And these arches, which were built, still operate to this very day as part of the waterworks of London. But they were built by the New River Company in order to accommodate the upper part of their installation. The trouble was that when they came down, wiggling their way down from where, they had to accommodate several side streams of the River Lee, which interspersed the actual flow of the New River. And in fact, they had to keep the New River high up. It was held in a sort of trough, a wooden trough, lined with lead at some places, and actually brought up on arches over the streams which were actually feeding into the Lee. And some of these things still exist. You can walk the whole length of it, in actual fact. And some of these, the remains of these, and if the original picture I had this is Hugh's coat of arms with his pointed wolf's heads, and the upright hand is sticking out of the middle there someplace. Anyway, by the time that they got through the 1600s to the later of the 1600s, the enterprise had taken wings and was operating as a reasonably money-making enterprise. And they had at the Riverhead at Islington a very nice boardroom, which was fitted out with nice panels and ceiling, which subsequently has been pulled to pieces and put in store and reinstalled subsequently in several different reincarnations of the building at the New River Head. So you can, on that day in September, when you can go and spy on all sorts of things that you wouldn't normally be allowed, you can go into the Oak Room at Islington and see the boardroom of the River Company. And inside, this is the arms of William and Mary William. And notice he's got rid of the Tudor. Queen Elizabeth's Welsh dragon has been replaced by a Scottish unicorn with a corn on top. And here's his various Dutch and whatnot enterprises within the coat of arms. But that is the arms of William and Mary. And they have lots of rivery, sort of watery things carved on the carving. These pictures aren't very good because I was with a party and you're not allowed to stay beyond your stay and you have to poke the camera and click it and hope. However, when you come to the ceiling, this is the arms of one of the granddaughters of Hugh, who married a man called Mr. Green, and that's his coat of arms. And you can see at the top here, among the plasterwork, it's made to look as if it has the New River flowing down here. And there are various little bridges in plasterwork along the top. And here's William and Mary William. And here's the arms of Hugh. And here's his baronet's red hand. And here's his upright hand. right hand with his thumb on the right side, and the 3 wolf's heads on a green ground with silver underneath. And they're on a triangle, and not as straight through as his brother persisted in having right through the end of his life, still does, in fact. Anyway, the problem was getting the water from the new riverhead to this new pond at the top. And they thought, well, we'll have a windmill, that'd be good. And it will go around and pump the water off there. And somebody said, well, that's okay, except when the wind doesn't blow, it's a bit tricky. So somebody said, well, what you need is a horse engine. So you have to have 4 horses, and they keep going roundy round inside a building here, and that pumps the water up the hill to the upper pond. And that was thought to be quite efficient for a spell, until somebody invented a steam engine. And they had one of the very early steam engines, which fitted in a brick-built, you see the 2 walls of the brick-built building here, and the actual steam engine went up and down and pumped the water up with a steam engine from here. Now, this one, they did in fact install one, but it didn't work terribly well until they got, this is the actual picture of it, and you can see the walls and the smoke coming out the top, and the old windmill still inside here, which is now disused, but the actual steam engine was in here. But it wasn't very successful until the Bolton and Watt came along and said, what you need is one of our modern posh steam engines. And Bolton and Watt had more or less monopolized the new steam engines, and this is what they installed. So you've still got the 2 brick walls at the ends which support it, but it was in fact a rotary engine. And here's the actual furnace that makes the steam. And we won't go into steam engines, but they installed, in fact, one of the, in 1787, a rotary steam engine. This is what Mr. Bolton and Watt normally made. They were normally Birmingham makers of all sorts of fancy goods to go on your mantelpiece. But the engine house, which is still there, still persists, and the engines of Mr. Bolton and Watt were in this house and pumped the water up the hill to the upper pond. And that gave more pressure in actual to push the water out into London. Anyway, the chap who was in charge by this time was this character called Robert Milne. Here he is at the top here. Now, Robert Milne was a descendant of a long family of Scottish Edinburgh architects. And when he was in his 20s, he went to Rome and he won a prize for the Prix de Rome. And he, in fact, submitted a plan for a new bridge, which would be Blackfriars Bridge on the Thames. And although he was only in his 20s, he won the blinking competition, and they built the Blackfriars Bridge to his design in 1760. It was only the second bridge. The London Bridge was still there. Westminster Bridge had been built in 1760. In 1750 rather, and Robert Milne's bridge was built in 1760. And he also took over the running of the New River and its engineering. He also got the job of main surveyor to St. Paul's Cathedral in succession. He wasn't directly succeeding Wren, but he realized that it was Wren's job he had got, and he was in fact in charge of the burial of Nelson when they had to put Nelson in the crypt of St. Paul's. And he is in fact buried in St. Paul's right next to Wren, but he and his son and his grandson were engineers to the New River. This is the church at Great Amwell. You come down here from Van Eggs, and there's a lane that comes down, and the bridge is at the bottom, and the house here, which is called the Grove, which I gather is occupied by somebody to do with Van Eggs. I'm not sure about that, but it was built. It was Mr. Milne's house, and he occupied that house and built that monument, which is on the pond, which was the first picture we saw, which he thought was a good place to put a monument to Hugh Middleton and make it very poetic with that lovely willow tree weeping down. So this is the situation of, and the springs came out here and flowed down and formed the New River. Let's go on. That's the pond that we saw. I won't bore you with the details. You can read in some document what it says. It's all about how poetic it is, but you can go. Now, they used to keep this whole enterprise beautifully painted with bright green paint, and now it is getting more and more dilapidated, which is a great sadness. And they obviously got through an awful lot of green paint. This is the building by Amwell there, the cottage which is still there. This is a modern picture with the new river. And you see how still it is. It just flows very, very gradually, flowing all its way to London, and it doesn't go rushing along or flow in any way. The actual engineering of it at the period in which it was built and the fact that it still, in fact, works is what's a blinking miracle. Anyway, this is Amwell Church. That's the cottage we were looking at down here. And here's the new river going round here. And you can walk all down here. Mr. Milne's house is just here. Anyway, the two white buildings which you could see from by the banjo were put there because they were short of water. And they quite early on decided that they could pinch some water out of the River Lee and admit it to the new river, and it would keep the thing topped up. The only trouble was that the River Lee was navigable to the barges coming up to Hertford and Ware, and also used by millers, and they were very, very concerned that if the new river pinched their water, that they would not be able to run their barges. So they initiated a scheme whereby the water would flow into the new river, but only at a certain measured amount. And this shed, which is the first one you see when you look down from the golf course, and which is now looking even more dilapidated and needs renovating, was the first scheme to actually measure. This is Mike Kenzie's actual drawing of how he figured it was. It was a bit like the system behind your lavatory, and it has a ball cock. It had a boat which floated in the water, and when the boat floated up, it moved this thing up and down and emitted water from the River Lee into the actual new river. Now, I'm not describing the details, but Mike had it all figured out exactly how it was. But it was a bit like a ball cock on your toilet, which floated and emitted the water when there was enough water in the Lee to sustain an addition to the new river from the main course of the River Lee. Anyway, it worked for a certain length of time. And then after a while, they decided to replace it with this thing. This is Mike in person. He very kindly took me down there and walked me around and told me all the ins and outs and was extremely kind and allowed me to pinch his pictures. This is what's called the marble gauge. And inside there is some mechanism which measures the water coming now into the new river from the Lee at a controlled rate so that they don't pinch all the river out of the water out of the Lee. And that worked for a certain length of time, during which time there are quite a lot of these stone measurement and ownership stones down there. This one says, this belongs to the new river. This one says opened in 1608. And you can walk along down the bottom there and find these things. They, as I say, they're all under the brambles at the moment, and you have to wander around and find them, but they are there. And to bear witness to the actual building of this incredible construction. What you've seen, this is the picture that James Bentley uses in his Hertfordshire, which is has this marvellous bridges which they put, and the marvellous green paint. They must get through gallons and gallons of green paint, because if it's railings and it's painted bright green, then it probably is part of the new river. And if you go along the road from Hertford to Ware, on the left-hand side, you'll see these green railings. Now, they do need painting at the moment, but the thing that we're looking at is this building here, which is the new gauge, which now measures the water, which comes out of the Lee and down into the new river. So this is what's called the new gauge. And that's what it looks like close up. And you have to walk down there. I went down there with Mike in order to, and they were doing some work and whatnot. But it's quite interesting to see the actual Lee flows behind here, and the water flows out of the Lee and into the new river at this point. So when it gets to London, it goes in a very tortuous course and ends up at Stoke Newington here. And there are two big reservoirs at Stoke Newington, which did exist from about 1700, I think. And they still exist and are, in fact, now part of a sort of nature reserve. And if you look opposite them, I'm trying to get, there's a square here. Can you see this square block? Because the buildings, the houses have been laid out in their foundations on top of what was built originally as filter beds for the new river. And next to it is this contraption looking like a castle. which actually contained the steam engines. But the people in this part of Stoke Newington, which was quite a posh part of the London at the time, didn't want to look at steam engines, so they had to have them encased in a castle, which was built by Milne's grandson, in actual fact, and is still there to this day. And amazingly enough, you just walk in this gate, and when you walk through this gate, it says the Riverside Cafe, and you go through and have a cup of tea. And when you get inside there, to your great surprise, this is part of Mr. Milne's construction. When you get inside, you discover that there are people climbing up walls, and it's used as a climbing centre. And kids go in there and they have a cafe, and they have kids having climbing classes. It's quite exciting when you get inside there. I was completely gobsmacked to find that that was what was inside. The steam engines have gone. They were probably very fine steam engines, but they were taken out quite a long time ago. But it is now a very well-used local youth enterprise for allowing kids to climb walls, which amazed me at the time. And that's the outside of it. The steam engines, in fact, went into those buttresses. That was why they were built sticking out, and are to this day. And the initials on them are, I think, London Metropolitan Water Board, because by this time it had changed its name from the New River to London Metropolitan Water Board, and then subsequently to Thames Water. But it's still there, and you can actually walk around and see it, which I was amazed. Other steam engines follow the course of the river. This is the one at Great Amwell. There was a house. Every mile or so, there was a chap who was in charge of making sure that there weren't naughty boys fishing or anybody piddling in it, or if it got any leaks, he had to go and see to it. And he had to walk up and down and make sure that the thing was kept clean and safe, because it was in fact drinking water for London. And the steam engines were in these rather fine Byzantine type of buildings along the way, because subsequently they ended up pumping it further than the very top or the very bottom. And along the course of the river, there are several steam engine installations on the way down. That's the one at Great Amwell. But you see the green railings and the green paint. This is the pub. I think this is one that somebody was mentioning. This is the Crown and Horseshoes at Enfield. And the New River flows in front of it with one of these nice little iron bridges. So it still flows in and out, sometimes underground, sometimes above ground, and it ends up at Islington, to its great surprise. And that's where it ends up, which is opposite Sadler's Wells Theatre. And this is the offices of the London Metropolitan Water Board. It is now converted to rather posh flats. But here's the engine house, which still persists behind it. And here's a round pond, which they've perpetuated in a round pond in memory of Mr. Backhouse's duck pond, which is still there. And they've also did make a path to go all the way from Islington, all the way up to Ware. Now, when I inquired into this, I got a very strange response. I was told, no, we don't allow that anymore, because there's a risk of terrorism and interference, and somebody might poison the whole of London. So we don't encourage people to go along the river path, and we don't publish a guide to it, which they had done in the past, and made quite a thing about it being a public accessible facility. But now they don't, in fact, publish a guide. I was told, in fact, that the guide that was in the county library should be removed because it was a security matter. Anyway, we shall see. However, the idea was to have a footpath along the side, and you can walk all the way, and people walk, and they've got the same green railings, and it goes all the way. This is just past Great Amwell. It goes all the way to London and all the way up to Ware. And Mr. Middleton is commemorated at the other end at Islington with a statue of himself standing on Islington Green in the middle of Islington at the other end of the river. Now, it's now past 9 o'clock, and I'm now going to shut up because there is quite a lot more to say.